The Dark Ages have long captivated the minds and imaginations of the modern world. Of our many historical periods considered difficult, dangerous, and unusually life-threatening, the Dark Ages is usually near the top of that list. However, while life during the period was objectively rough, many of the commonly held ideas about the Dark Ages are flat out wrong. So, today we're finally asking, were the Dark Ages really that dark? But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other infamous periods you would like to hear about. Okay, somebody turn on a light. What is this? Ye X-Files? One of the primary myths perpetrated by contemporary misunderstandings of the era is that women in the Dark Ages were extremely mistreated and underprivileged, essentially forbidden from doing anything other than being homemakers and raising children. Now, life in the Dark Ages definitely wasn't easy if you were a woman, but women were needed to work in a variety of industries outside of the home, because if they didn't, everything would grind to a halt. In fact, some trades like weaving, jewelry making, parchment production, and ale brewing were specifically thought of as women's work. And women were also allowed to own businesses, sell property, and inherit fortunes. It wouldn't be until roughly the 1500s, around 5 centuries after the conclusion of the Dark Ages, that European women's rights were stripped away. Sometimes dark is better. Another misconstrued fact is that everyone was really short during the Dark Ages. Like, really short. This idea was proliferated because the doorways of many surviving homes and buildings from the Dark Ages had very low clearance. But research of human remains indicates this is just factually incorrect. Humans of the day seem to be average to taller height. So the question is, why are all these castle doorways so dang short? Was it part of some kind of castle obstacle course to keep wealthy landowners in shape? Believe it or not, it was a simple case of insulation. Castles are gigantic homes made of stone, so as a result, they're not terribly energy efficient. It was tough to keep the heat in and the cold out. It was easier to keep these homes warm during the winter months if they had smaller doors and windows. The smaller the doorway, the easier to hold warmth in. The smaller the window, the less heat escapes. The buildings were all constructed with an eye on structural integrity and a desire to ensure that their residents could survive the harsher climates, regardless of their height. It's been accepted that religious fervor overpowered scientific progress in Europe during the Dark Ages. Astronomer Carl Sagan once called it a millennium gap, a poignant lost opportunity for the human species. Was he right on some fronts? Yes. Was he also wrong when viewed from some historical perspectives? Absolutely yes. It was an extreme period of religious intolerance and strife. But that doesn't mean that all scientific progress came to a screeching halt. Some brilliant discoveries were also made during this time. After historians and archaeologists delved deeper into the Dark Ages, they began to discover more advocacy for scientific advances among people of the day. There were textbooks and parchments inscribed with scientific information, and diaries kept by monks and scientists revealed that many people were attempting to push humanity in the scientific direction. Of course, they didn't always succeed, but they were giving it a shot. And that should count for something. And as for the idea that religious extremism specifically stopped scientific exploration, the Catholic Church actually sponsored scientific research, viewing any progression as a net positive for humanity. But they never figured out how to make communion wafers less dry. From a modern perspective, the Dark Ages may seem to be a wasteland of religious fervor and extreme theocratic doctrines, which is difficult to argue with because the Crusades happened. We've made a bunch of movies about them. But at the same time, for the average, everyday Dark Ages person, it was a much less pious time than you probably think. One of the reasons we view this period as so fervently religious is because so many surviving paintings and texts of the day were guarded by the church. There were likely tons of other secular works of culture and education produced that were lost to history because they lacked similarly powerful protection. As a result, we tend to think of the Dark Ages as all church all the time, while in reality, that's a misconception based on all the cultural artifacts the church saved. But also, the Crusades did happen. So, there was some religious extremism. Have you ever heard the idea that people in the Dark Ages did not live past the age of 30? Well, that's another Middle Ages misconception, but not in the way you might be hoping. See, the truth is that the average life expectancy was 30, not the average lifespan, which is a very different thing. Lifespan refers to how long a person can live, which wasn't very different from what it is today. They had some pretty old kings back then. Infant mortality, lack of proper medical science and care, and widespread poverty all dovetailed into a population that did struggle to survive. And the average life expectancy was 30. But that's not the same thing as saying most people didn't live past 30, because that suggests most people made it anywhere near that age. An estimated 26.9% of newborns died during their first year of life, and 46% never saw adulthood. It was bleak, for sure. But more importantly, those kinds of numbers really threw the average. Life was objectively brutal, but in a way we don't really consider, with the privileges of contemporary society. The number of years that anyone who made it into adulthood could live wasn't changed at all. It was just in the Dark Ages. You were pretty unlikely to actually make it to being an adult. This may be the one misconception about the Dark Ages that's actually worse than what we thought. Another popular air-quoted fact about the Dark Ages that usually pops up whenever you're at a bar is that people back then did not have any clean water, so they lived on ale. Well, this probably would have made life in the era more bearable. This is patently false. Medieval people drank water and were able to tell when it was clean enough to drink. If they saw still water with tons of pond scum or a lake with a dead knight floating in it, they did not plunge their lips in for a long, cool drink. Take this quote from 9th century Abbot Ferrier Lupus Servatus, which reads, "Let us make use of a healthy, natural drink, which will sometimes be of benefit to both body and soul, if it is drawn not from a muddy cistern, but from a clear well or the current of a transparent brook." So while people of the era maybe hadn't figured out boiling water to sterilize it, they at least knew enough to avoid drinking water that was dirty or stagnant, and weren't just getting zooted on ale. At least, not always. A lot of media, set in the Dark Ages, perpetuates the misconception that Europe was mostly homogeneous and white. But the truth is that the area was much more diverse than how it is typically depicted. There's overwhelming evidence that people from North Africa and the Middle East lived in Europe during the Dark Ages, as far back as the 8th century, if not even earlier. In fact, medieval Europeans were comprised of many races, religions, and skin tones. So, while modern film and TV stories set in the Dark Ages depict Europe's residents as uniformly Caucasian, some historians and scientists are leading discussions to change ethnographic perceptions of the period. We have said it before and we will say it again. Martin Lawrence's Black Knight was ahead of its time. Have you ever noticed how everyone in a movie about the Dark Ages was always really dirty? This idea has permeated our culture so greatly that an urban legend has sprung up suggesting that people in medieval times literally did not bathe. As you could probably guess by the way everything else in this video has been going, this was not true. People took baths, you weirdos. Some archaeologists have even uncovered combs, brushes, and other grooming tools from the era. However, there was a class divide delineating who was able to bathe more often than others. The wealthiest got the lion's share of this practice, while some peasants would use rivers and ponds to clean up because they couldn't afford to waste good water. Now, did everyone in the Dark Ages smell bad? Well, very probably, yes. Fragrant soaps were pretty much just for rich folks, and those Old Spice ads wouldn't start airing for a few hundred years. When considering the myths and legends surrounding the Dark Ages, the chastity belt comes up almost as often as Robin Hood. If you're not familiar, in theory, there's special underwear that prevented women from having intimate relations with men while their husbands were away during the Crusades. Less Victoria's Secret and more Victoria's denial. The first recorded appearance of the chastity belt is in German military engineer Conrad Kuiser's Bellifortis, a 15th century manual of military technology. As historians evaluated the text, it became clear that the idea of this piece of below-the-equator fashion was not something regularly utilized, but rather a joke or metaphor. As further supporting evidence, any chastity belts that have actually been discovered were covered in pads that needed to be replaced often, negating the idea that they would have been worn by women for the entire duration of a military campaign. But at the end of the day, while we do have some misconceptions about how dark the Dark Ages truly were, it still was a cruel and harsh world. Food was scarce, medicine was rare, and life was difficult. So be thankful you're watching this video instead of taking an irregular bath in a windy castle. Or, more likely, not making it to your first birthday. So what do you think? Would you have survived the Dark Ages? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.